I think everybody will agree that Shabbos is very important in Judaism. The question is, how important? In the hierarchy of things that you have to do as a Jewish person, are there other things that could be more important than Shabbos? So what we're going to look at is what arguably could be one of the most important things the Jewish people ever did in our history. And then we'll compare that to Shabbos, and that will give us a bit of a sense about how important Shabbos is. So the parashas that we're reading at the moment, over the last few weeks, including this week and continuing into next week, they focus on the project to build the Mishkan, which is a massive thing. Not a massive thing physically. The Mishkan actually wasn't that big. But the goal of this project was an incredible goal, to be able to take a physical set of materials, build out of that a physical structure, and then anticipate that Hashem's divine presence would then be manifested inside that physical structure. It's a massive undertaking, something the likes of which had never happened before in history. I mean, in history there were people who they built altars and they brought offerings to Hashem. That kind of concept existed. But the idea of placing Hashem's divine presence inside a space is a very radical concept. And it was something that was going to revolutionize the entire Jewish experience, not only for the Jewish people in the desert, but eventually when they'd get to Israel and they'd have the Mishkan there for a few hundred years, and then eventually they'd build the Beis Hamikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. So this is a really, really big deal. And in many respects, this is supposed to achieve the purpose for creation. So in terms of priorities, it's a very, very high priority. Everybody had to get involved, everybody had to contribute, and everybody had to physically engage in the building of the Mishkan. The men and the women, it's very clear in the Torah that the men and the women participated. And according to the Midrashim, the children participated in some degree as well. So it's this massive collective project of the entire Jewish community getting involved. And it makes sense why they'd all have to get involved, because it's such an important project. So here comes the question: if it is so important, do you suspend activities on Shabbos? That's the question. Do you have to suspend activities on Shabbos? So this parasha that we're reading this week it's the moment where Moshe is going to tell the Jewish people about building the Mishkan. That means that the preceding three parashas, each of which spoke about, to some or other degree, they spoke about the process of building the Mishkan. That was all Hashem speaking to Moshe. And he's giving him all of the details, which Moshe is now going to convey to the Jewish people. So this is, in a sense, crunch time. This is where it's all going to play out. So in order to have this conversation, the Torah tells us, Vayakel Moshe. Moshe assembles the entire Jewish people. Now that in itself is already interesting, because there are many, many mitzvahs, and some of them obviously are more important. Okay, you've got to be careful with the word important, but you understand what I mean by that. Some of them speak to very fundamental issues, some of them speak to less fundamental issues. And we don't find any responsibility that Moshe has to collect and assemble the entire Jewish people to tell them mitzvahs generally. So this is obviously a big deal. He's getting everybody together. It's obviously a very important message that he's about to tell them. So he gathers the entire people together, as you see at the beginning of this week's parasha. And what does he tell them in the beginning of the parasha? He tells them that for 6 days your work should be done. And he specifically says it that way. He doesn't say that you should work for 6 days. That's how it's presented in the Ten Commandments, but not in this conversation. In this conversation, he tells them 6 days your work shall be done, and then on the seventh day you'll have a day of Shabbos. He actually calls it Shabbos Shabbosoin, which is like a Shabbos of Shabboses. And then after that, then he starts to go through the details with them about how you're supposed to build the Mishkan. Okay? So just imagine, just picture the scene. Here you are, you're part of the Jewish community. You know that you're going to consistently be getting new information from Moshe because the Torah is being explained at this point in time. So every day or every few days or whatever it is, you're going to be told, okay, here's a new part of what it is to be Jewish, etc. But now there's this massive gathering that everybody has to participate in. And he tells you two things. Number one, the law of Shabbos. And number two, the law of building the Mishkan. And then obviously he's going to go into the details of exactly what it is that you have to do in order to build this Mishkan. So Rashi immediately picks up on this and he says, we got two very important messages that are going to be told to the Jewish people, yeah? And the order in which these messages are being told tells you something. First, they're being told about Shabbos, and then they're being told about the Mishkan. What does that tell you? Shabbos takes precedence, right? That's what it tells you. First, you're told about Shabbos. That illustrates that Shabbos is the primary, it's the most important. And then you get told about the Mishkan, so now you'll realize that as important as the Mishkan is, and it's such a big project, etc., but the fact is, Shabbos is going to take priority. So you have to suspend the construction of the Mishkan over Shabbos. That's what he's telling us, right? And at first blush, when you read it, it sounds like the way that Rashi is explaining this is that because the Torah first tells us about Shabbos, and then it tells us about the Mishkan, that's how we know that Shabbos must take priority over the Mishkan. So, let me ask you, based on that, do you think, with the information that we have so far, do you think that it's fair then to say that whenever the Torah will produce or present two mitzvahs in proximity to each other, one after the other, that logically now, whichever one is told first is obviously the higher priority, and whichever one is told second is obviously the secondary priority. Makes sense, right? In fact, that's probably how most people would present things. If I have two things that I want to tell you, I'm going to tell you the first thing, I'm going to tell you the most important thing, and then I'll tell you the less important thing. And maybe now we've established a golden rule for the whole of Judaism, that the way to identify within the Torah which of two mitzvahs takes priority is to see the order in which they were presented. You think that's fair to say? Sounds logical, right? Okay. Now let's test if that is in fact the case. And the way we're going to test it is, we're going to look for two other examples where there's another mitzvah together with Shabbos, because that will be very close to what we're exploring, and we'll see if that is in fact what the Torah does. So the first example we're going to use is, remember, this is where Moshe is telling the instruction to the Jewish people about how to build the Mishkan. But before that, there's the time where Hashem tells Moshe about building the Mishkan. Okay? Now, when Hashem tells Moshe about building the Mishkan, there, Hashem first tells him the instruction about building the Mishkan, and then after that, he then also tells him about the laws of Shabbos. In other words, the way that Hashem conveys it to Moshe, it sounds like the priority is to build the Mishkan, and then after that, you have the law of Shabbos. So, if the golden rule is that whichever mitzvah is presented first, that's the one that takes priority, then it should be consistent. It should be that way when Hashem is speaking to Moshe, and it should be the same when Moshe is speaking to the Jewish people. And that's not the case. When Hashem speaks to Moshe, first he tells him the law of the Mishkan, and then only after that, he tells him the law of Shabbos. And the expression that he uses over there is, it was in last week's parasha, Ach es Shabsosai tishmoru. After you know how important it is to build a Mishkan, Ach, but you should also remember that you have to keep Shabbos. So that's like a qualification. You're first given the mitzvah is to build a Mishkan, and then you're told, Ach, but as important as the Mishkan is, don't allow it to override Shabbos. So that sounds like it's saying the priority is the Mishkan, but there is an exception when it comes to Shabbos. In other words, that sounds like we're still going with the same theory that says whatever mitzvah is produced first, that is the one that's the priority. And that's why you have to use a special word, like a special disclaimer word, ach, but, to say, in spite of the fact that this is really important, but you also have to know that when it comes to Shabbos, Shabbos does not get put on hold in order to build the Mishkan. That's example number one. Example number two is in a completely different set of laws. This is, we haven't got there yet. It's coming up in the parasha still in quite a number of weeks' time. The parasha Kedoshim, which is in the book of Vayikra. Over there, the Torah talks about Ish imoy ve'aviv tiro. It tells us that we have to respect our parents. So in that sentence, it says Ish imoy ve'aviv tiro, a man should show reverence to his father and to his mother. Ve'es shabsosai tishmoru, and you should keep Shabbos. Okay, so now, which one is presented first? Respect for your parents, right? And then second, to keep Shabbos. So that sounds like the priority is what? To honor your parents. To honor your parents. So now what if you have a conflict between the two? What happens if your father tells you to do something which transgresses Shabbos? So now, is the priority to listen to your parents, or is the priority to keep Shabbos? If we're going to follow the golden rule that we're trying to establish over here, which is that whichever mitzvah is presented first, that's the one that's the highest priority, then the one that's presented first over here is to respect your parents. That sounds like if your parents tell you that you have to do something which is against the laws of Shabbos, you have to listen to your parents. That's what it sounds like, right? Now, is that the way it is in practice? No. In fact, Rashi's commentary on that verse, he clarifies for us that the reason the Torah says that you should honor your parents or revere your parents and you should keep Shabbos is to clarify that if your parents insist that you do something which breaks Shabbos, you actually have to ignore your parents and you have to rather fulfill the requirements of Shabbos. And then he explains why. Rashi explains why that is. He says for a very simple reason. The reason that you think you have to follow your parents is because the Torah tells you have to respect your parents, which is valid. But your parents have to respect Hashem. So you and your parents share a responsibility to respect Hashem. Yes, you have a responsibility to respect your parents, but you and your parents both have a responsibility to respect Hashem. And therefore, when Hashem says that you can't do X and Y on Shabbos, you and your parents have to respect that. Therefore, your parents don't have the authority to override Hashem, and therefore you still have to keep Shabbos, even if your parents tell you to break Shabbos. What does that show you? That shows you that logically, the first mitzvah that was presented should take priority. But there's another logical argument over here, which illustrates to you that despite the fact that honoring your parents is really such an important thing, the fact is that there's another logical construct over here that your parents also have to show respect to Hashem. Therefore, your parents can't override what Hashem has to say. So now, at this point, what have we got? We've got three cases. We've got our parasha, where we first are told about Shabbos, and then we're told about the Mishkan, and we want to use that as a template to say that whatever mitzvah is presented first, that is the priority mitzvah. Therefore, Shabbos overrides the responsibility to build the Mishkan. But then we have two other cases where we see that Shabbos overrides the first mitzvah, meaning to say that even though the mitzvah that's presented first, you would have thought is the mitzvah that takes priority, in the case of Shabbos, Shabbos overrides that priority. So in Hashem's instruction to Moshe, first he tells him about the Mishkan, implying that the Mishkan is priority, and then he uses an exception word in order to tell us that Shabbos actually takes priority. And in the case of honoring parents, first he says the mitzvah to honor parents, which implies that that's obviously a high priority in Judaism. But then after that, he gives us the rule that actually both you and your parents have to respect Hashem, and so therefore your parents can't override Shabbos. Now the question is, so which one is it? Is the golden rule that whichever mitzvah is presented first, that always takes priority? Or does it always depend on the context? Which one is it?
So, sorry, if the Ten Commandments have got anything to do with it, with priorities, number 4 is remember Shabbos, and number 5 is honoring parents.
Okay, good. So they would be an example that endorses our perspective that the first mitzvah takes priority. That would be a good example, right? So the question is over here, do we or do we not have clarity on this issue? Because there seem to be arguments in both directions. And to be perfectly honest, there are commentaries who want to say that the golden rule is that whichever mitzvah is presented first always takes priority. And that's why when it came to Hashem telling Moshe about the Mishkan, he had to use a special word, ach, in order to tell us that here the golden rule does not apply. And likewise, when it came to the question about honoring parents or keeping Shabbos, we have to give a whole logical explanation about the fact that the parents also have a responsibility to respect Hashem, so that you will know that normally the golden rule is the first mitzvah takes priority, but this is an exception. Now, the only problem with that is that why would the Torah go through such a convoluted approach? If the golden rule is that the first mitzvah always takes priority, then you don't have to use a word like ach in order to clarify. Just tell us the law of Shabbos first in that conversation. And you don't have to give me a whole explanation about the fact that your parents also have to respect Hashem, just say Shabbos first, and then say honor your parents. So it doesn't seem like it's so clear that always whatever mitzvah is presented first is the one that takes priority. It sounds like there's more to the story over here, and we have to work out what's going on. Now, very often, when you want to understand what's going on in the Torah, you don't only read the commentary of Rashi, which obviously is our first port of call, because Rashi is the expert at giving us the insight into what the Torah is really saying. You actually have to pay attention to the words that Rashi uses, because his words are always very carefully chosen. In this particular case, when it comes to our parasha, and first we get the law of Shabbos, and then we get the law of the parasha, the law of building the Mishkan, Rashi says something that should catch our eye. He does not say that the Torah presented the law of Shabbos first. He says that Moshe told the Jewish people the law of Shabbos first. That's a very important distinction. In other words, had Rashi told us that the Torah first gives the law of Shabbos and then it gives the law of the Mishkan, I'd be able to derive from that this is a pattern in the Torah. That when the Torah lists a particular mitzvah first, that means that mitzvah is a priority. But the fact is, if you had to go right across all of the 613 mitzvahs in the Torah, obviously not all of those mitzvahs are given in a particular juxtaposed context, and it's not always about how the one mitzvah is prioritized over the other mitzvah, but wherever that possible priority does play out, it's not always consistent. It's not always that the first thing that is mentioned is necessarily the priority. But what Rashi's telling us over here is that there's a distinction between how Hashem tells the mitzvah to Moshe and how Moshe tells the mitzvah to the Jewish people, and that is something that should worry us. Why would Moshe do things differently to the way Hashem did? Again, in last week's parasha, when Hashem told Moshe about the Mishkan and about Shabbos, first he mentioned the Mishkan, and then he mentioned Shabbos. And that actually makes a lot of sense to us, because he's basically saying the Mishkan is this incredibly high priority item, and at the same time that it's such a great priority, you have to be sure that you don't lose sight of Shabbos. That makes sense. The question would then be, if that's how Hashem spoke to Moshe, when Moshe comes to address the entire Jewish people, and remember that this is specifically the entire Jewish people, that's the emphasis at the beginning of the parasha, that he assembles everybody together, why is Moshe changing things? Why is Moshe changing the order in which this mitzvah is being given? That's what's really caught Rashi's eye over here. And so what's playing on Rashi's mind? That somehow, when Moshe is going to tell the Jewish people about the Mishkan, it's at that point that he's going to have to emphasize for them that Shabbos takes priority over the Mishkan, even more than Hashem emphasized it to him. And if we want to get to the bottom of that, we're going to have to ask ourselves the question, when Moshe gets up to address the Jewish people and to introduce them to this law of building the Mishkan, what's he actually telling them? In other words, obviously he's telling them this is what you're going to have to do, that's what the Mishkan is made out of, these are the materials that we're going to need, this is what it's going to look like, this is how big it's going to be, etc. All of the practical details, obviously he's going to tell them that. But the deeper question is, what's he telling them behind the story of the Mishkan? In other words, when Moshe gets up and he tells the Jewish people that we're about to embark on this project, how's he selling the project to them? What's the purpose of the Mishkan? Why are we making a Mishkan? So what would you say? What's the selling point?
It's a place for Hashem to dwell.
It's a place for Hashem to dwell.
And you need to respect Hashem before you build the Mishkan.
Okay, so you're going to say that his selling point to them is, we're going to create a space, and Hashem is going to manifest in that space. And obviously, if you want to create a space for Hashem, you have to conform to whatever the requirements of what Hashem wants, and that's going to include Shabbos. Okay? So that's one possible argument, one possible angle, is that it's telling them that we're going to create a space for Hashem. Anything else?
Once the Mishkan is built, right, that mitzvah is done. Shabbos is continuous. It's every week.
Okay, good. So to build the Mishkan is a once-off project, whereas Shabbos is a weekly project for the rest of history. So then that would tell you that obviously Shabbos has some level of priority, which I think is a valid point. Doesn't address the question though. So when he tells them we're going to build a Mishkan, What's he telling them we're going to achieve by building this Mishkan? So the one possibility is that we're going to achieve the divine presence, which is true. What else is he telling them? You're going to say something.
Well, I was going to say the enthusiasm to build the Mishkan is going to be so great that they probably want to continue it on Shabbos.
Good. Okay, so that's a really, really powerful point. That they're going to be so enthusiastic about building the Mishkan that maybe they're going to run into Shabbos because they're so enthusiastic. Now, the question is, why? Why would they be so enthusiastic? There are many, many mitzvahs that you can't do on Shabbos, and we don't find the same level of concern that Moshe has to make sure that they're absolutely clear about the fact that you can't do this mitzvah on Shabbos. So now we're getting to something really important. Why do you think they're going to be so enthusiastic about building the Mishkan, possibly even more enthusiastic than doing other mitzvahs? So again, it comes back to the question, what is Moshe telling them about the Mishkan that's going to generate so much enthusiasm? So if you're going to say that the enthusiasm is because we're going to create an environment where the divine presence could be manifest, I get it. That's obviously something which is very exciting and very attractive, and you could see that they'd be very driven by that. But that doesn't sound necessarily very personal to them. And when somebody's enthusiastic about something, it's usually because it's very personal to them.
No. Sorry. Vayakal, this was a team effort, this Mishkan. It was not an individual effort.
No,
It was a whole gathering of all the whole of Israel.
Okay, so if it's a team effort and everybody's participating, that would actually be an argument for why a person would be less likely to be so enthusiastic that they'd overstep the mark, because you're working as a team, and the team will look out for each other, and the team will say, okay, listen, we've got to shut down now because it's Friday afternoon. So then you don't have to worry so much about people getting so enthusiastic and so caught up that maybe they're going to, build a Mishkan when they're not supposed to. So what's going on over here that might have driven them with such passion or with such drive or with such excitement, whatever the case is, that we're worried that maybe they're going to run into Shabbos? What's the selling point of the Mishkan that's going to get them so excited that maybe they're going to turn into a runaway train? So let's try and remember the chronology. When does the Mishkan happen? Moshe comes back down from the mountain, which means that the Mishkan is happening when? After what?
They have received the Torah.
After what? After the golden calf. That's what's happening here. In other words, we all know that after the fact, when the Jewish people reflected back on the golden calf, at the time they got caught up in the frenzy. But when they reflect back on the golden calf, they realize that was a terrible mistake. And as a result of the mistake of the golden calf, they almost lost their relationship with Hashem. We know that because Moshe had to go and argue the case for the Jewish people, to protect the Jewish people. Hashem was ready to literally get rid of them and start again from scratch. So they now have the insight into how bad the golden calf was and how damaging it was, that it could have theoretically wrecked their relationship with Hashem. Now, not only is Hashem saying to them, okay, listen, I'm going to forgive you, but he's now offering them an opportunity to create a space that will invite Hashem back into their lives. That's what it means when we say that the divine presence is going to be in the Mishkan. That means that Hashem is saying, I'm allowing you to invite me back into your lives. Can you imagine how enthusiastic they must have been about this? Not only are they being forgiven for the most terrible mistake in the history of the Jewish people, but they're being given an opportunity to completely reverse their effects and do the exact opposite of what the golden calf did. The golden calf put a barrier between themselves and Hashem, and now the Mishkan is going to create a space where, as the Pasuk tells us, V'shochanti b'soicham. Not that I'm going to dwell in it, in the space, but b'soicham, I'm going to dwell within you as the people. So that's what's going to drive this incredible enthusiasm, that they're going to want to obviously get this going as soon as possible. And that's why we're worried that maybe they're going to overstep and they're going to be perhaps too enthusiastic. And that's why Moshe, when he speaks to the Jewish people, has to tell them, you've got to prioritize Shabbos over the Mishkan, because you would believe that the Mishkan is such an important project and such a passion project for you that maybe if you get a little bit carried away and you run into Shabbos, that's okay. So I have to prioritize Shabbos over that. Okay? So that was a really good insight. And please God, tomorrow we'll unpack that further and understand why that then has to be done in this great assembly, etc. Which is all obviously relevant to the conversation.